My videos get criticized online fairly often, and naturally, this is the internet. No one has the luxury of posting their thoughts without being scrutinized, regardless of what they say. But with Ayanokoji especially, a lot of the discussion online is filled with myths and repeated misunderstandings about both his character and how he should actually be analyzed. Although very recently, it came to my attention that someone who occasionally goes on a streak of criticizing Classroom of the Elite made a kind of response video to my Ayanokoji vs Johan video. Now, I'll preface this by saying that anyone is welcome to criticize the information in any piece of online content. We're all human, so we learn new things every day and we all make mistakes. The issue here though is that this particular person approached my video through a very biased lens, going out of his way to pitch my voice up so I sounded like a 14-year-old, but also cutting out parts of my video to make his own points look stronger and push a certain agenda. I could understand if he had simply misunderstood parts of the video, but making an entire response while still getting most of my points wrong is a bit more direct than that. So the purpose of today's video is not just to respond to his criticism, but also to clear up some of the broader misconceptions surrounding Ayanokoji that were present throughout that video. I'll go through around 10 of his main critiques, then branch out into some of the more general myths about Classroom of the Elite and Ayanokoji's character, before finally talking about intelligence scaling itself and the nuance involved in analyzing a character's thought process. So first, I originally compared them in general intelligence, which I explained was a collective name for fluid and crystallized intelligence, originally postulated as a psychometrically based theory by psychologist Raymond B. Cattell, and further expanded with John Horn later. Fluid intelligence refers simply to your ability to adapt to new situations, like recognizing new patterns or solving new problems. It can be simple as solving a riddle you never heard before or learning how to drive a car. Crystallized intelligence instead is defined as the ability to utilize skills, facts, and knowledge acquired via prior learning and experience. General intelligence together is something all of us use on a day-to-day basis. When solving a hard math homework, you use your crystallized knowledge to use basic facts you know, alongside your fluid reasoning to adapt to the new equation you have to solve, and ultimately come to an answer. My critique makes no mention of fluid nor crystallized intelligence in his video, and instead simplifies it to intelligence in its own way of defining it, before misconstructing my next points, essentially a reductionist fallacy and a straw man in one. He says in his video that I claimed Ayanokoji is smarter than Johan due to Ayanokoji escaping the White Room. Meanwhile, Johan escaping Kinderheim is somehow inferior. In reality, I was comparing the situations. Ayanokoji escaped the White Room's grasp while he was out of commission because he was in his father's house at the time. The thing is, he only had a single chance to go to Advanced New Junior High School, the only place where his father's influence wouldn't be able to reach. The White Room being out of commission does not change anything about Ayanokoji's adaptability itself, because if he was not out of commission, then he wouldn't have had the chance to escape, and there would be no feat to analyze here. Intelligence isn't measured by the height of the walls you jump over, but by the complexity of the problems you solve once you're over them. The feat itself is the fact that in less than a day, Ayanokoji managed to act so convincingly like a normal person that he fooled everyone around him. This was after spending all his life in the confinements of the White Room that strictly prohibited social interaction, and many of those years were with him being there alone after everyone else dropped out. Johan's escape, on the other hand, while still very impressive, isn't nearly as good as changing your entire lifelong behavioral patterns in a day. What Johan did after he had suppressed the medicines that kept him asleep was to go around telling different lies to the kids, implied by the story's context to be their names, yet we can't be entirely sure. The chaos of the brainwashing being undone caused them to be extremely violent, and the adults in the place couldn't contain the non-rebellious children. This constant infighting is what ultimately gave leeway for Johan to escape. The novelty of Ayanokoji's feat is what surpassed Johan's. It's not simply that Johan escaped a higher security facility whilst Ayanokoji didn't, which by the way, wouldn't be accurate to call Kinderheim and the White Room. The White Room is a highly funded secret project with the goal of advancing Japan against other nations, while Kinderheim 511, the specific institution Johan escaped, is a singular orphanage of no remarkable funding nor security. Johan used instability that already existed in his environment and gave it one final push to put everything into chaos. Ayanokoji, on the other hand, had to reprogram himself to act entirely different based on nothing but the things he'd witnessed alongside his escape. By the very definition of fluid intelligence, Ayanokoji's feat would simply qualify as being superior. Next, he judges the White Room's training in the crystallized intelligence, saying that Ayanokoji's training is abstract and that we have to make assumptions about it. While with Johan, we actually see him apply said knowledge. This is a very twisted way of viewing both characters and also the video I made, as I clearly and openly explain Ayanokoji is well trained in these subjects. We also know that Ayanokoji had to master these subjects because in the beta level of the White Room, which he was part of, anything below a perfect score was a failure. And in the novel, when meeting Amasawa on the island, she proves to identity from the White Room by naming topics that they studied there, like the theory of relativity and social constructivism, before they were even 12 years old. So Ayanokoji was studying academical subjects at the level of a master's before he was even a teenager and still getting constant perfect scores. This is necessitated by logic to be true, even if we don't see it on screen. It should be common sense really. Yet, the YouTuber admits this and truths that the only narrative regarding the White Room is that it was meant to make Ayanokoji the perfect human, which is also wrong, as the goal of the White Room is to create 100 politicians and to make all of them perfect, in the sense of acting out on orders and not making mistakes in the field itself, because that's how the White Room project aims to lead Japan to the top. Meanwhile, if you look at his arguments for Johan's supposedly more concrete knowledge, we have almost nothing to go off in reality. Johan knows Latin because he coached Carl, and that is pretty much the only on-screen evidence of Johan knowing a language. For the others, including Czech, German, English, and French, we are told he knows them and that's it. There's not a time when we undeniably see him use those languages fluently. For me, this is not an issue, as it should logically follow that he will know them. But if I were to judge Johan the same way this YouTuber judges Kiyotaka, then I would have to say that we simply don't have enough evidence that Johan knows these languages, and thus write him off as only knowing Latin, which wouldn't make any logical sense, as the story takes place in Germany and Prague, meaning Johan would have to know at least Czech and German, as he would have to navigate his way around. This is a Watsonian way of analyzing a story, as in using in-universe explanations to make interpretations, because Johan exists in a place that requires him to know certain languages and he should logically know those languages. But when judging Ayanokoji, this YouTuber switches to a dualist point of view, as well as mixing in the death of the author, two contradictory ideals, claiming that since we don't know the information in detail, there's nothing to do but assume that the information simply doesn't apply or doesn't exist. This is selective skepticism, and if you were to judge both characters in the same way, then his argument would fall apart. Let's judge both characters' ability to acquire knowledge purely from their upbringing. Using the Foreign Service Institute benchmark, we know that both French and English are category I, the easiest category. Learning either languages takes 6 to 7 months to read, to what's called professional working proficiency. If we assume the average of 6.5, then Johan learning both in 13 months actually fits the standards, which to say he's not special at all academically. In fact, the US military puts soldiers through the Defense Language Institute, where they study for 6 months to learn either French or Spanish. While you might say that it'd be easier for those to learn, it's actually the opposite. As humans grow, their fluid reasoning drops, or at best stagnates. So being a kid is the best time to learn, given even more credibility to claim that Johan, while exceptional, is not supernatural when it comes to academics and his learning ability. Meanwhile, if you look at Kiyotaka and purely compare what he studied verbatim, then it takes roughly 45 years to get enough academic curriculum to reach social constructivism and theory of relativity. So it doesn't matter whether you compare what was verbatim explained on screen or what logically makes sense. Ayanokoji would outclass in both cases here. The next part he mainly judges is the emotional intelligence section, which he doesn't address directly but just cuts out parts of my video to frame the arguments incorrectly, as he already did with the general intelligence part. In my original video, I used the ability model of emotional intelligence, brought into text by John D. Mayer and Peter Salovey. You can think of it simply as the emotional version of IQ. In the emotional intelligence part of the video, I went over emotional understanding, facilitation, perception, and management. This YouTuber chose to compare only one small part of the argument for emotional facilitation and says that I use it as justification for Ayanokoji being a better manipulator. This wasn't even in the manipulation section. His counter argument for why Ayanokoji's Hirata feat is inferior is that Johan framed Tenma for murder, which has really nothing to do with emotional facilitation at its core. In fact, a majority of his video focuses on manipulation, a category in my original video that went to Johan over Ayanokoji. But besides that, framing Tenma for murder in the situation Johan was in isn't even within his top 10 best feats. Think about it. Johan somehow had access to nitric acid, somehow was able to plant it inside the exact whiskey bonbons that the 3 doctors chose, the candy being somehow resealed exactly as it would be from the factory, which would be extremely difficult since he'd have to use a syringe as the story takes place in the 1980s, so resealing the candy would be extraordinarily difficult. Using a syringe is the only other option, and not only that, but because of the cellophane, he needed a heater to reseal the many holes he made, and even if he managed to do all of that perfectly, the nitric acid's reaction with the candy would give off a gaseous and color-changing reactions, none of which show up in the manga. While Johan kills Junkers 9 years later, the murder of these 3 doctors is the base of the suspicions around him, and it's entirely based in a logically impossible feat. Yet apparently, Ayanokoji blackmailing Kei to gather gather information for him or trading with Kushida to get access to all the secrets he knew about the other students is too much of a magical scenario that can't be logically accepted. I think it's clear that my critique doesn't have deep knowledge of either character to be making the claims he's making, but let's continue. A critique within this section he also has is about Ayanokoji's emotional perception, where he also brings up the on-screen versus off-screen debate and attempts to subtly switch his own position. He essentially says that Ayanokoji simply guesses the information he arrives at and sometimes states things that we don't know how he arrived at. He's not exactly wrong, as he's only watched the anime, which I spoke about multiple times in comparison to the light novel and how he omits a lot of details, such as making Ayanokoji know information without showing how he learned them. But besides not bothering to read the novel, he also didn't bother to watch my video, as I explained the way Ayanokoji reaches conclusions for the feats we talked about. In fact, I do that for both characters. How did Ayanokoji know Kamuro was lying about working with Arisu? He noticed a logical inconsistency in their motivation. This doesn't require external information, he just used logical reasoning. How did Johan know that Richard was using alcohol as a coping mechanism? He investigated his past records and found out that he was completely sober when shooting that young boy. We weren't told how he got this information, but logically speaking, he could have got it from Jun-suk, or perhaps otherwise through other methods of his influence. How did Ayanokoji know that Yagami hated him deeply and created a strategy to expel him around that? He analyzed a small amount of information he had from Amasawa and his observations of the agent's relationship with Tsukishiro and concluded the type of treatment that the 5th generation was getting, using his knowledge of psychology to uncover an inferiority complex. How did Johan learn Shuwa's lifestyle and isolate him? He took a job as Shuwa's Friday reader, from which he gathered information about Shuwa's life, his blindness and general history. From there, he found out the missing sun link and used Carl to connect the Shuworld. We have no idea how Johan knew about Margot Langer, nor Carl, nor the connection to Shuworld. It's all based on pure interpretation from the readers. Yes, you can argue that somehow Johan got access to our letters archive, and perhaps he still recognized Shuworld from when he saw a glimpse of him as a child. But meeting Carl was out of pure chance, and it was only because of their consecutive reading days that the relationship bloomed, and Johan heard about Carl's mother and connected the dots. If we use a dualist perspective, then only Ayanokoji has feats that can still stand, while the stories themselves fall apart logically. While if you use a Watsonian perspective, then both characters have extremely impressive ability to gather information and use it to make conclusions that help their strategies. My critique says that Ayanokoji only deals with high school kids, and that his show is PG-13 and doesn't have deaths, so because of that, he can't be smarter than Johan. However, that's an extremely flawed way of thinking, because not only does Ayanokoji deal with narratively dangerous characters like Tsukishiro, who's an intelligent assassin, and Takuya Yagami, he's also an extremely capable White Room student, but also the characters Johan deal with aren't intelligent logically in the same way the classroom of the elite characters are. Besides Runge, whose only feat of intelligence is his acute senses and good memory, is there really any other character in Monster that showed feats for high intelligence? Or should we simply assume they're smart because they're in a narrative position to be so? That would be unfair, like saying that Anthony Resta is smarter than Johan because Resta worked with the SBK and technically aided in capturing and defeating Light, and Light essentially subjugated the whole world to his whims, killing millions of people while this Johan killed way less. So, using scale or stakes to scale a character's intelligence ends up with such illogical interpretations. I think I made sufficient arguments debunking his false claims, so I'll move to going over some of the misconceptions about Ayanokoji. 1. He's not emotionless. We actually see him show emotions a lot throughout the novel. Even if he's not as silly as is showed in earlier volumes, we see him show empathy for people around him when he's not in his survivor mode programmed by the White Room. The main scene that you might think of when looking at the anime is when Sato asks why Ayanokoji didn't smile, and he claims in his monologue that he didn't deem her worthy of that. Extremely off-putting and sociopathic thing to say, but novel Ayanokoji actually monologues that he enjoyed his day with her, but didn't smile or laugh because he didn't want to give Sato any false hope in them having an actual relationship, because he understood that he isn't the type of person she's looking for, and that he can't be a proper significant other to anyone due to how he thinks. I have a video on season 2 comparisons with the light novel as well that you guys can check. 2. Ayanokoji's opponents are mere high school kids. Almost all of the characters in the main cast have their own collection of impressive feats. None of them are endangering the lives of people in an entire country, but they're using logical strategies to gain advantages or win people over. And lastly, Ayanokoji's privileged upbringing. Due to undeniably odd behaviors from many fans of Kiyotaka, people who hadn't read the novel, like my critique here, got the idea that Ayanokoji's upbringing was privileged and overall desirable, as if he got many skills for free and became a great person. when the reality of his story paints something very different, as Ayanokoji is someone constantly haunted by his white room trauma, something that stops him from forming proper relationships. The fact that he'll eventually have to go back once he finishes his 3 years in NHS is also something he can't escape. If he manages to find actual joy or love in the school, he'll have to let it go eventually. If anything, the very reason he came here was that he was trying to disprove his father's ideology about how to treat people. He wants to be defeated in a fair competition to prove to his father that people outside the white room can be just as capable for their own life experiences, without having to live manufactured minimalistic lives. To close this off, I'll begin to explain a bit more about scaling, which this YouTuber actually mentioned, as he believes that comparing their intelligence is a dumb debate because Johan is a better written character who serves the themes of his story better. While I think a lot of us agree on that point, this doesn't really matter of the purpose of comparing intelligence. Ultimately, it's just a hobby, just like comparing power levels or comparing writing itself. Whether Goku is better written than Vegeta doesn't matter if someone is specifically asking you who's the stronger one between them in a specific part of the story. And when it comes to specifically the intelligence scaling, there's a lot of nuance that flows over a lot of people's head. Some of it actually did come up in this very video. For example, some people think that the scale of the environment matters for a character's intelligence, when it really shouldn't. While it's true some people believe it does and use that when scaling, but for my videos, that's not really what I'm trying to aim for, as I don't think Melo could outsmart Akiyama simply because Melo is a gang leader while Akiyama plays card games. Nor do I think that Ryuuen should outsmart Tokuchi because Ryuuen is a detective while Tokuchi is a baseball player. I think that a character's outsmarting abilities should be judged by the logical ability to make strategies on the fly, counter other characters to oppose them, deduce or gather information effectively, and overcome the limitations of their own specific and unique scenarios. This will make it the most fair to judge characters because we're looking at what they do and not simply what story they are part of. This is just what I think. You're free to disagree or scale in a different way, but it's all subjective at the end of the day and should be done in good faith. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any fun.